Hi, it's Frank. I want to once again talk about some melodies. Specifically, I want to talk about melodies that are based a little more on scale passages than they are simply triads. So in recent videos, I've talked about exactly that, about triad usage and the way you can break up triads to make them part of the melody. I've also talked about some of the guidelines that often accompany creating melodies, the limited range of an octave, short segments that are used to create them, and stepping instead of skipping, so-called conjunct disjunct. Well, these melodies we're going to look at today use some of those aspects, but instead of emphasizing triad usage, what they do instead is they work off of some scale. And it's a couple scales we haven't really talked too much about, but they are derived from scales that we have covered, major and minor scales. And that's the case with a lot of scales. Most often they're derived from major or minor in some form or fashion. The first melody I was going to take a quick look at is by Shawn Mendes, song made popular, I guess, about 2015 maybe. This is called Stitches, and specifically this is the 8 measures that covers the chorus for that song. I'll just play through it first, and I should mention I've gone ahead and transposed this to the key of A minor just for simplicity. Both melodies, in fact, are in that key, but if you were to capo the first fret, you would be playing in the original key, for instance, if you wanted to play along with the recording. Now, the first thing that stands out to me about that, possibly you too, is that skip that happens in the second 4-measure phrase. That's where you're moving from the A, B, C in this particular key up to the G. That's a skip of a fifth. That's followed by a smaller skip down to a minor third, the note E, and then a step down to D. Almost like you're kind of undoing the fact that was a fairly big jump, that fifth. And notice that does start that phrase, which is some scale-wise motion, which is what I wanted to talk about. Specifically, if you stretched out all the notes in this 8-measure chorus, you could lay them out as a scale called the A minor hexatonic scale. Now, if you're familiar with A minor, which you should be because I've covered that in previous videos, you know that that's 7 unique notes. It doesn't overlap with C major, but again, A minor can be thought of itself as just basically all the natural notes of the major scale, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. To create a minor pentatonic scale, which is actually a better point of reference if you're looking at the two kinds of scales, you would simply take away some notes from the minor scale. Specifically, what you would take away would be the note B, the second degree of the minor scale, and then the note F, which is the 6th note in the A natural minor scale. If you did that, you would have 5 notes, A, C, D, E, G. Those are very common, and you've heard them everywhere, whether you realize it or not. The minor pentatonic scale is all over guitar music. A hexatonic, most frequently, adds back one of those notes that we pulled out, specifically that 2nd degree, which is B as in boy. So we get a 6-note scale as opposed to a 5-note, which includes A, B, C, D, E, G. Continued up another octave. The scale, as well as the examples, by the way, that I'm talking about, are listed in the PDF that I have linked in the description if you want to take a look. So that A minor hexatonic scale then covers a total of 6 different notes. Okay, and it's laid out again with the octave so you can see it if you look at that PDF. This melody actually makes use of exactly those 6 notes. It moves them around in different ways, really in just 2 main patterns. The first pattern is in measures 1 and 2, which is repeated, and then the second pattern is measures 5 and 6, which is also repeated. Again, that idea of short segments. It also, this melody, fits very neatly within an octave. So again, the main thing is it does use some skips, but notice the skips, as I started to mention earlier, are broken up by scale movements. And to that end, that's what I wanted to highlight. It's not that we're avoiding triads, by the way. I don't want to give that impression as I talk about this song or the other one. In fact, if you look at the last note of measure 2, C, and the first 2 notes of measure 3, E and G, you have a C major triad laid out just as you're approaching that chord in the 3rd measure. So again, it's not a matter of avoidance exactly, but there doesn't have to necessarily be a dependence on scales, on triads as the primary building block of a melody. And that's what I wanted to highlight with both this one and my next example. Speaking of, the next example is actually taken from Imagine Dragons, the band. This is from their song Radioactive, which if I recall was just a few years, maybe just released just a few years before the Shawn Mendes tune. This song, once again, does something with the scale that emphasizes the scale movement a little bit more than just any sort of triad use. In fact, there's no definitive triad use in this 8-measure segment. Once again, this is the chorus for the song Radioactive. This song was originally in the key of B minor, or Dorian, which I'll touch on in a second, meaning if you capoed the 2nd fret, you could play along with the original. In this case, this one sounds like... So in this case, what we find, first of all, is that we are just outside that octave range. I like to point that out because the song kind of starts with some of those skips. After that high A I played, I stepped down to G, but then notice there was a skip down an octave to G, and then a skip right back up to the high G before I stepped down to F sharp, and then a small skip to D as in dog. That's the opening phrase, the first 4 measures of this. The next phrase begins with smaller movement, the E to D, then a skip down a 5th to A from that E, and then go back up high to the E, and then back down to the A. And then the same basic thing repeats in the last 2 measures of this 8-measure phrase. The main thing I wanted to highlight about this one, and why I said Dorian earlier, is because unlike the first example, this isn't purely pulled from what could be considered the A natural minor scale, or a matter of something close to pentatonic or hexatonic. This actually borrows almost all the notes that are found naturally in the Dorian mode. So any major scale, because we haven't really talked about this too much, can have a total of 6 different modes associated with it beyond the actual major scale itself. That is to say, they're unique. This goes back in history a long ways. I'll save you from a lot of the background on it, simply because the easy way to remember these modes is by starting on a note in any given major scale and playing from that note up to its octave. When you do that, you're walking through all the modes. I'll talk a little bit more about those in future videos, but for now the idea here is that when I say A Dorian, I'm playing a mode that's based on the G major scale. So that means there's 1 sharp found on. And sure enough, if you look at the end there of that first phrase of this particular chorus, you'll see that F sharp comes up twice just before dropping down to the D as in dog note. So the unique notes in this scale, the so-called A Dorian mode, are A, B, C, D, E. And here we get the F sharp, because as I said, it's part of the key of G, so it's raised to F sharp from F natural, and then the G, taking it up another octave. So again, all the notes we would find in G, but we're starting and ending on A. And the way the mode is being used here, notice that the melody both starts on A, the tonic of this particular mode, and then ends technically on the note C, although the A is right before it, C being a third away from A, which helps emphasize a minor sound. That's both the first chord of the first phrase and second phrase, and as it turns out, even though I didn't put it here, it's the first chord that comes back in the next phrase. So again, there's an understanding of that in crafting this melody, helping emphasize those tones, A and C, helping to really emphasize the minor sound. Interestingly, the only note that isn't used from that mode here in this particular example is the note B as in boy, the 2nd degree note of this particular scale. Once again, that's not to say whenever you use a mode or a scale of any kind, major or minor for that matter, that you have to use every note in it. In fact, sometimes the notes not used give you a pretty clear indication of what's going on in terms of the overall tonality. And in this case, that minor element that I mentioned, because the Dorian mode is normally thought of as a minor sounding scale that features a 6th degree that's raised. Again, instead of an F natural, like A minor, A natural minor, it's F sharp. That minor aspect is kind of being emphasized here, even though we're moving, of course, through 3 major chords in addition to the A minor. But once again, overall, when you step back and you listen to this or the previous example, certainly at full speed, you hear a much more scale-like approach to it than simply walking through major and minor triads. And that's the kind of point I wanted to emphasize in looking at these melodies compared to ones I've talked about in the past. Again, there's not a sense that you have to do it one way or the other, and frequently that you blend everything, scale components, of course, as well as triads. I think in previous videos, in fact, I mentioned between triads sometimes being played in any inversion. You'll see scale tones that are used to either lead up to or away from certain notes. The idea here is that these 2 melodies in particular, though, stand out as having a lot more emphasis on that scale-based aspect than simply triads blended with scales. All right, well, that's it for this week. And I hope you got something out of this. Take care.